All right, so next up we have Yulia, whose presentation is titled The Guidance of a Spirit Animal and the Growth of Arts-Based Research. So to introduce Yulia, Yulia Yusupova is a PhD student in the Philosophy, Cosmology and Consciousness program at the California Institute of Integral Studies. She holds an MA from the same program and a BSc in Applied Chemistry and Biology from Ryerson University in Toronto, Canada. She has been published in the Journal of Conscious Evolution and has presented at several conferences, including with the London Arts-Based Research Centre. 15 years ago, after learning how to meditate, she began to experience an abundance of intuitive phenomena, predominantly clairvoyance, precognition, and synchronicity. Since then, she has been studying these experiences phenomenologically and developing a thesis which integrates them with the modern class of electromagnetic theories and consciousness studies and the emerging science of biogeomagnetism. Throughout this time, an arts-based research practice of synchronicity had also grown itself, which now utilizes a unique method of collaging spontaneously captured photographic resemblances between synchronistically related images and events. Julia resides in Toronto, but travels the world collecting stories and experiences that aid her work. So thank you. And you can, once you've got up your slides, I will begin your timer for you. I'll show it on the screen so that you can also keep track of how much time you have.
Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes, we can see that. You just bear with me for 1 second while I fix the timer. Okay. All right, I'm going to begin it now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me here. I'm very amazed at how many similarities Heather's presentation had to my own. In this presentation, I will explain how science, art, psychology, and spirituality have all interwoven in my life and work. I've always loved science since I was a little kid, and when I got older, I received my undergraduate degree in chemistry and biology. However, I also became aware that certain traditional philosophies of science, like materialism and positivism, are holding us back in advancing in knowledge. As I got older, I had a spiritual awakening, which allowed me to see the importance of fields other than science, our personal subjective experience, the arts, psychology, and spirituality. So in this presentation, I want to demonstrate how science integrated with all of these fields rather than opposed them. About 15 years ago, I became interested in learning how to meditate and tap into my intuition. I took several classes that taught me to do this, and soon after, I suddenly received a vision, a clairvoyant image. Even though this image lasted only a few seconds long, it stunned me to my core, as mystical experiences tend to do. I was on my way to work that day on the subway train when I sat down and closed my eyes for a little nap. A second later, I witnessed a vivid moving image of two gold birds flying together in perfect synchrony from right to left of my visual field. The image was vivid, three-dimensional, and detailed. The birds were shimmering and sparkling, and the flight left an audible whoosh in my ears. As I opened my eyes in awe, the phrase "two golden birds" hovered in my mind. I googled this phrase and came upon this poem from the Upanishads, which are ancient texts from the Indian Vedic tradition, written by the same people who invented meditation and were known to be clairvoyanteers. So I will read this poem from the Mundaka Upanishad. Like two golden birds perched on the selfsame tree, intimate friends, the ego and the self dwell in the same body. The former eats the sweet and sour fruits of the tree of life, while the latter looks on in detachment. As long as we think we are the ego, we feel attached and fall into sorrow. When you realize you are the self, supreme source of light, supreme source of love, you transcend the duality of life and enter into a unitive state. So with these references to the ego and the self or the soul, I was astonished, feeling that this vision represented some otherworldly or divine communication, an archetype, such as were described by Carl Jung. Later, from reading Jung, I would find out that he indeed also experienced a similar archetype of the gold bird, which he called Phanes, the god of light. So this was my initiation into depth psychology. I drew this simple artwork on the right in an attempt to capture this vision, and many more visions would follow through the years. Now, this vision also brought interesting information which could be read through its specific symbolic details. So, for example, the perfect parallel alignment and the synchrony between the birds and the sparkling light quality of the image. Okay? Soon I became drawn to bird flocks and murmurations and discovered some interesting research as a result. So let's watch this quick video. So you see the birds are always turning as if they're more or less one being at the same time. And this was in fact evaluated in one study to test whether each bird is merely reacting to the ones beside it. If this incredible alignment is simply the result of reaction times, then the overall movement is something akin to when a stadium crowd performs a wave. The responses to the visible actions of neighbors simply propagate as a linear causal chain through space and time. But is this in fact what birds do? Well, for one, it was found that these propagating waves travel through bird flocks at immensely fast rates. In the laboratory, dunlins were tested and showed reactions at 38 milliseconds on average. But in video recordings of active bird flocks, these times were only 15 milliseconds from bird to bird. And just to give you an idea, human dancers trained to react to their neighbors do so at 107 milliseconds, while the average visual reaction times of humans are 194 milliseconds. So this incredible speed of the individuals in the flock perhaps points to some other phenomenon other than the birds reacting to another in a causal manner. Have you also wondered why you never see these birds bump into each other? Can you imagine, say, a crowd of humans in a city square? There would be tons of bumping and getting in each other's way, but this never happens with birds. Another finding is that when the flock makes a turn, different birds will turn at different angles, and this shows not just the mechanical repetition of one to the other, but rather the flock shape as a whole persists and maneuvers fluidly and organically. Overall, the researchers concluded that flocks seem to be governed by some underlying behavior or field. The scientist Rupert Sheldrake described this as the morphic field. Each individual is both influenced and influencing all others. And this now begins to sound very much like the holographic principle in action within the field. In holography, the whole is contained within each individual, as is each individual is contained within the whole. The incredible coordination is observed in other species too. Schools of fish swim in tight formations, wheeling and reversing in unison. If a predator attacks, the school will either leave a hole in the middle or split in half and rejoin again, passing the predator. Another effect is known as flash expansion, and it's like a bomb explosion, with every fish suddenly darting away from the center simultaneously. This occurs in 1/50th of a second, and each fish somehow knows exactly where it's going to move and where all others are going to move because there are never any collisions. Termites build their nests by different individuals working on separate columns, and then suddenly, spontaneously joining them together at just the right height. In an experiment when a steel plate was placed in between the different columns, thus preventing any kind of chemical communication between the separate groups, they all still spontaneously followed the same building process, as if aligned to some invisible blueprint of the nest. Bees somehow keep the inside of the hive at a constant temperature, despite the fluctuating weather all year. Ants are very interesting because they have a caste system of roles. When any of the ants from the castes like foragers and maintenance workers are threatened, nothing happens. But when individuals from the caste of patroller ants are threatened, somehow all the other patroller ants in the colony, though they're separated by distance, instantly know and begin heading back towards the inside of the nest for protection. This happens faster than it would take for any pheromone signal to be communicated between them. Finally, marine creatures like the Portuguese man-of-war are not even one animal, even though it looks like one. Rather, it's a collection of different organisms in a colony that have learned to work together and share resources. I was also beginning to understand a deep underlying connection between the synchrony of moving individuals and the concept of synchronicity, as was defined by Carl Jung. In fact, through my own experiences with synchronicity, I was developing a photographic research method that could record these experiences visually and analyze them. This is one example. On the left, you see a photo I took in which a bird got captured mid-flight in perfectly picturesque position, a precise, spontaneous alignment. The next day, in my class on the Sanskrit tradition, I learned about the ancient Vedic ritual that builds an altar in the shape of a bird, as you see in the picture on the right. So there's a bundle of meaningful resemblances between these two images that happened within a day. First, we have the spontaneous reference to the Indian Vedic tradition, just like my two golden birds vision. Secondly, the bird's particular poses with spread wings are known as the heraldic pose. And finally, the many individual tiles making up the overall bird shape of the altar resemble my own art installations that I was making at the time. And I will show you these a little bit later. Here is another example of a synchronicity. I was driving through the indigenous territory of Navajo Nation in Arizona. There had already been a few encounters with some beautiful birds earlier that day in the Grand Canyon, as Arizona is known for its diversity of birds. Suddenly, I spotted this cloud in the sky that resembled another bird. Later that evening, I also noticed that the body wash in my Airbnb was dove, and it had the same symbol, the same image of the dove. Now, through research, I found out that the Pueblo Indians, which are also residents of Arizona, were known to perform a dove song to invoke doves, which would gravitate to water holes and springs, and thus show the people where water could be found in the desert. How resonant then that the specific body wash had this phrase, deep moisture. It's as if the information from the ancestral practice of the land came through in this multiplicity of images, resemblances, and symbolic connections. And this is how Jung also described the affinity between archetypes and cultural myths. My arts-based research method also uses collaging of two images in such a way, side by side. And this once again resembles the two birds from my vision that were also flying side by side. Besides the study of synchronicity, I also became interested in the science of consciousness. First, there is the heart problem of consciousness, which is one of the greatest enigmas of modern science and philosophy. It makes it clear that a neuron is not the same thing as a subjective feeling of some experience, like, say, the feeling of the color red. Thus, we can't say that neurons equal consciousness, only that their activity somehow correlates with it. The body and mind run in parallel. Secondly, neural synchrony is a known definitive marker of conscious awareness in the brain. This is when thousands of neurons across various regions of the brain spontaneously fire at the same time, forming a giant synchronous dance, something akin to the flock of birds. Finally, neural synchrony allows the many different neurons to form a global unified electromagnetic field in the brain. As you can see, all three of these meanings, parallelism, synchrony, and light, or electromagnetism, were all evident as symbolic details in my vision of the two birds. Hence, the vision was leading me towards this focus on consciousness, the science of consciousness. Now, going back to art, throughout this time I was also making art installations in parks. And these were made of multiple cardboard cutouts of birds with decorative paper taped onto them. A flock of these would be secured to a fence by wires in the overall form of some symbolic image, like a larger bird or an eye. And I was inspired by superorganisms, applying this idea to collective consciousness, or the idea of many becoming one. I was also making artsy quilts, and here are bits from one with the same bird flock idea. And interesting that quilting itself as a practice also uses individual patches of different fabrics to be sewn together into one whole. Now, another modern science is quantum biology, and it has solved the long-standing mystery of yearly bird migrations. How is it that birds know and remember where to fly for thousands of miles every year? It turns out that they have magnetic receptors in their eyes, which align to the magnetic field of the Earth. On the left, you see what different directions look like in their view. And at the top of the diagram, showing the red and blue particles, you see what kind of alignment occurs in a magnetized magnet. So once again, you see this element of synchronization or parallelism is undeniable. So the quantum spins of electrons in the magnetic receptors in the bird's eyes align in a similar manner in the presence of the magnetic field of the Earth. And that's how birds know where to fly. My final understanding came as a result of a Reiki session that I had. During the session, I saw another vision, and in this vision, the two golden birds merged and became one white bird. The bird flew over some kind of a shining grid. As I looked deeper into this grid, suddenly I felt incredibly dizzy, as if I was spinning in circles on the Reiki table. Years later, I would finally interpret the grid as the crystalline energy grid that New Age spirituality describes enveloping the earth. And this explains why delving into this high energy realm made me so dizzy. Spinning in circles also made me think of a spinning compass needle, and that occurs in the presence of a strong magnetic field. On the right, I've added the Ace of Cups tarot card, which represents spirituality. And I think this is another powerful image that displays a white bird, just like my Reiki vision, and it's diving towards water, just like my dove experience. And Jung used a similar image of a bird diving into the sea to retrieve a fish as a metaphor for the descent into the collective unconscious to retrieve an archetype or intuition. So as I read these bundles of resemblances in all of the images, I began to feel into the connections between the spatial navigation of birds and the guidance of intuition. My understanding is that both operate on the same principle of magnetism. Knowing that consciousness has an electromagnetic component, perhaps the collective unconscious, is information stored and carried by the magnetic field of the earth itself. Our individual fields merge with the earth's field, just like the two golden birds, the ego and the self, merge. And this allows for all kinds of atemporal, acausal experiences like synchronicity, and the kinds of instantaneous knowledge you see in individuals within superorganisms. Thank you so much, and I hope I was able to demonstrate how birds became my spirit animals and have guided my research into weaving science and art. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. There was 1 second left on the timer, so perfectly timed, and